He's coming. Please. Just pretend you're our dad. The words were barely a ghost of a sound, but they hit Kang Jun-hyuk harder than a bullet. He stopped mid-sip, the steam from his black coffee curling past eyes that had seen too much blood to ever be truly soft again. He felt them first, two small, shivering bodies sliding into the velvet booth beside him, their tiny hands clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only life raft in a stormy sea. Jun-hyuk turned his head slowly. Two identical girls stared up at him. Their braids were coming undone, and their cheap jackets were soaked through by the freezing Seoul rain. But as the girl leaning into him whispered again, a scent hit him like a physical blow. Jasmine and burnt sugar. It was the exact scent of the woman who had vanished from his bed 8 years ago. His heart, a cold organ he thought he'd successfully buried in the underworld, gave a singular, violent thud. He looked into their wide, terrified eyes, his eyes, amber, sharp, predatory. Outside, the rain hammered against the glass. Inside, the air turned toxic. The cafe door chimed and 3 men stepped in. Slate gray coats, professional posture. They didn't look like street thugs, they looked like cleaners. The kind of men Jun-hyuk used to hire to make bodies disappear forever. Beneath the fabric of his tailored Italian blazer, Jun-hyuk's fingers found the cold, textured grip of his Glock. He didn't draw it. He just waited. Daddy! There you are. The twins' voices were high, forced, and thick with a terror no 7-year-old should ever know. One of them gripped his sleeve, her knuckles white. Please, she whimpered. The man who hurt Mommy is outside. He says he owns us. Please, just for a minute, be our dad. Jun-hyuk lifted his gaze as the lead hunter began walking toward their table. For 8 years, he had tried to be a ghost. He had tried to live a life of restraint. But the ghost was gone. The hunters thought they were walking toward 2 lambs and a helpless businessman. They were about to realize they'd just walked into the lair of a dragon who finally found something worth burning the world for. But before we see Jun-hyuk's next move, I want to know who is watching this journey with us today. Drop a comment below and let me know which country or city you're watching from. And if you want to see if this father can protect his hidden legacy, hit that like button and subscribe to join our storytelling family. The lead hunter's footsteps were heavy, echoing with a misplaced confidence against the cafe's tile floor. He came to a halt at the edge of the booth, smelling of wet wool and cheap cigarettes. Up close, the scar through his eyebrow looked like a jagged lightning bolt, white against his tanned, weathered skin. He didn't even look at Jun-hyuk. He looked at the twins as if they were nothing more than stray luggage he had been assigned to retrieve. Zara. Zion, the man said, his voice a low, grating rasp that made the girls flinch. You've had your fun. You know you aren't supposed to run away from the estate. Your father is very disappointed. Why don't you come with us now? Before this gentleman gets caught in the middle of something he's too expensive to survive. Jun-hyuk didn't move. He didn't look up from his coffee. He watched the way the steam danced in the air, a phantom of the woman who had smelled like jasmine. Zion's grip on his sleeve was so tight, he could feel her tiny heart racing through the fabric of his blazer. It was a frantic, bird-like rhythm. It was the rhythm of a life that belonged to him. You're standing in my light, Jun-hyuk said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a smooth surface of ice over a dark, deep ocean. The hunter finally shifted his gaze, blinking in confusion. He looked at Jun-hyuk's pristine suit, the Patek Philippe on his wrist, and the calculated stillness of his posture. He saw a wealthy man of business, a man who paid others to take risks. He didn't see the monster that the underworld whispered about in hushed tones. Listen, pal, the hunter sneered, leaning down to plant a gloved hand on the marble table. This is a private family matter. Take your expensive coffee and walk out the door while you still have legs to carry you. Jun-hyuk set his cup down. The clink of the ceramic was the only sound in the cafe. I don't think you heard me correctly, he murmured, finally lifting his gaze. His amber eyes locked onto the hunter's with a predatory intensity that made the man's smile falter. I said you're standing in my light. And more importantly, you're talking to my daughters. The hunter's eyes widened, then crinkled into a mocking laugh. He looked back at his 2 partners by the door, signaling them to move in. Your daughters? Look at them, then look at you. You've got the wrong script, buddy. These kids belong to Derek Lawson, and we're taking them back. He reached out a hand, his thick fingers splaying as he moved to grab Zara by the shoulder. He never touched her. In a blur of movement that defied the physics of a man sitting in a cramped booth, Junhyuk's left hand shot out. He didn't punch, he gripped. His fingers clamped around the hunter's wrist with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. There was a sickening crunch, the sound of small bones in the wrist yielding to superior power. The hunter let out a strangled gasp, his knees buckling. Before he could scream, Junhyuk's right hand appeared from beneath the table, the black muzzle of his Glock pressing firmly into the man's solar plexus. "Don't," Junhyuk whispered, his face inches from the hunter's. "If you make a sound that scares them, I'll make sure the last thing you see is your own heart." The other two men reached for their jackets, but Junhyuk didn't even glance their way. He didn't have to. The air in the cafe had reached a boiling point. "Tell your friends to keep their hands exactly where I can see them," Junhyuk commanded, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise. "Because right now, I'm deciding if I want to be a father who teaches forgiveness, or the man I used to be. And trust me, you don't want to meet the other guy." The lead hunter, face turning a pasty shade of gray, choked out a command to his men to stand down. He looked at Junhyuk, really looked at him this time, and saw the dragon. The father title hadn't just been a lie to save the girls. In that moment of bone-snapping violence, Junhyuk had claimed them. He had marked them as his. And for the first time in 8 years, the Mafia boss felt like he finally had a reason to kill again. The lead hunter was still whimpering, his wrist a ruined mess of bone and ligament. When Junhyuk leaned in closer, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very floorboards of the cafe. "Go back to Derek. Tell him the children have found their real father. Tell him the dragon is awake." With a contemptuous shove, Junhyuk sent the man stumbling back into his two terrified accomplices. They didn't wait for a second invitation. They scrambled out of the door and into the sheeting rain, the chime of the cafe bell sounding like a funeral knell behind them. Junhyuk didn't waste a second. He turned to the twins, his movements transitioning from lethal to strangely gentle. Zion was still shaking, her small face buried in the crook of his arm, while Zara stared at him with wide, intelligent eyes that seemed to be searching for the man beneath the monster. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Where is your mother?" "The alleyway," Zara whispered, pointing toward the back entrance of the cafe. "She told us to run. She was bleeding, and she told us to find help," she said. "She said to find someone who looked like he could fight." Junhyuk felt a pang of grim irony. She had always been smart. 8 years ago, she had escaped a drug trap by running into the arms of the most dangerous man in Seoul. Today, she had sent her children to do the same. He scooped both girls up, one in each arm. They were lighter than he expected, their small frames feeling fragile against his broad chest. He kicked open the back service door, stepping out into the narrow, trash-strewn alleyway where the rain fell in heavy, gray curtains. He found her slumped behind a stack of wooden crates, her silhouette nearly swallowed by the shadows. Amara Cole looked like a broken porcelain doll. Her coat was soaked with a mixture of rainwater and a deep, crimson red that pooled around her hip. Her face was deathly pale, but as Junhyuk knelt beside her, her eyes flickered open. The recognition was instantaneous. It was a physical collision of two souls who had spent nearly a decade trying to forget a single, incandescent night. 8 years ago, he had been a rising kingpin with a heart of stone, and she had been a terrified woman fleeing the man she thought loved her. They had shared 8 hours of feverish, desperate connection before she vanished with the sunrise, leaving nothing behind but the scent of jasmine and a void in his chest he tried to fill with blood and money. "Junhyuk?" she breathed, her voice a fragile rasp. She looked from his face to the children clutched in his arms, a ghost of a smile touching her bloodless lips. You found them. "I found all of you," he growled, his jaw tight as he tucked the twins safely into the back of his armored black sedan parked at the alley's mouth. He returned for Amara, lifting her with an ease that betrayed his simmering rage. As he settled her into the leather interior, his fingers brushed the side of her neck, feeling the frantic, weak thrum of her pulse. "Derek, he won't stop," Amara moaned, her head lashing against the headrest. "He thinks they're his property. He thinks I belong to him." Junhyuk slammed the door shut and climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life like a caged beast. He looked into the rearview mirror, meeting the amber eyes of the twins, eyes that were undeniably, hauntingly his. The past wasn't just coming back. It was sitting in his back seat, bleeding and terrified. He shifted the car into gear, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt as he tore away from the cafe. "Let him come," Jun Hyuk whispered to the empty air, his grip tightening on the steering wheel until the leather groaned. "He's been hunting a woman and children. Now, he's going to find out what happens when the dragon hunts back." The tires of the sedan hummed against the rain-slicked pavement, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that seemed to pull the world back through time. In the back seat, Amara's breathing was shallow, a ragged whistle that harmonized with the soft whimpers of the twins. As Jun Hyuk stared into the blurring lights of the Seoul skyline, the present faded, replaced by the ghost of a night that had never truly ended. It had been 8 years since the Grand Hyatt Gala, a night of glittering masks and hidden daggers. Derek Lawson had stood there, the golden boy of international finance, his arm wrapped around Amara's waist with a grip that was more about ownership than affection. Amara had been radiant then, though a flicker of unease danced in her eyes every time Derek handed her a fresh flute of champagne. She didn't know that Derek had already begun to see her as a trophy that was losing its shine, a woman who asked too many questions about his offshore accounts. He hadn't just wanted to leave her, he wanted to break her. He had slipped a concentrated dose of a synthetic sedative into her drink, a slow-acting poison designed to leave her suggestible, helpless, and ultimately, at the mercy of the cleaners he had waiting in the wings to dispose of his inconvenient fiancée. But Derek had underestimated her spirit. As the world began to tilt and the lights of the ballroom turned into jagged shards of glass, Amara had felt the cold, oily hand of betrayal. She hadn't stayed for the finale. She had stumbled toward the elevators, her vision tunneling, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had reached the top floor, her fingers fumbling against a heavy mahogany door that hadn't been fully latched. She had collapsed into a room that smelled of expensive tobacco and rain. Kang Jun-hyuk had been standing by the window, a glass of neat whiskey in his hand, a man who had just finished a war and was looking for a reason to feel human. He had turned, expecting an assassin, only to find a woman with jasmine-scented hair falling into his arms, her skin burning with a drug-induced fever. "Help me," she had whispered, her fingers clutching his lapels. "Please, don't let them take me." Jun-hyuk had known many things, but he hadn't known mercy until that moment. He had carried her to the bed, shielding her from the world as the drug took hold. That night, the lines between protector and lover had blurred into a desperate, incandescent heat. It wasn't just a one-night stand. It was a sanctuary. For 8 hours, they were the only two people in a world that wanted them dead. She had seen the man behind the Mafia boss, and he had seen the woman who was more than just a victim. But when the sun rose, the reality of their worlds had come crashing back. Amara, terrified that Derek would find her and kill the man who had saved her, had fled before the first light touched the Han River. She had disappeared into the shadows of the city, carrying with her the scent of his skin and a secret that was already beginning to take root in her womb. Back in the present, Jun-hyuk's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He glanced in the mirror at the twins, their amber eyes, his eyes, glowing in the dark. Derek hadn't just drugged a woman. He had unknowingly tried to murder the only heart Jun-hyuk ever had. The flashback faded, but the rage it left behind was a cold, steady fire. The time for hiding was over. The night was returning to its rightful owner. The black sedan glided into the underground garage of Jun-hyuk's private estate, a concrete fortress hidden beneath the sprawling luxury of Seoul. The air here was sterile, smelling of high-grade oil and silence. Jun-hyuk moved with a clinical efficiency, summoned his private medical team with a single, silent text, and carried Amara into the hidden infirmary while his most trusted guards shadowed the twins. He watched as the doctors worked, their faces masked and unreadable, as they stabilized Amara's wound. But even as the tension of the chase ebbed, a different kind of pressure began to build in his chest. One of the doctors, a man who had stitched Jun-hyuk's own bullet wounds for a decade, approached him with a handheld tablet. He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the two girls sitting on a nearby leather sofa, clutching identical plush blankets the staff had scavenged. "The blood work is back, boss," the doctor murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the heart monitor. "I ran the markers against your file as you requested. Just to be sure." Jun-hyuk took the tablet. The screen displayed 2 digital strands of DNA, overlapping in a way that defied coincidence. The probability of paternity was 99.9%. He stared at the numbers until they blurred into a series of jagged lines. It was one thing to feel the pull of fate. It was another to see the cold, hard science of it. These were not just children he had saved. They were a part of him. Every drop of blood in their small veins was a legacy he never thought he'd leave behind. He looked over at them. Zara was carefully smoothing the hair of her sleeping sister, her expression a mirror of the guarded, watchful intensity Junhyuk saw in his own reflection every morning. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was a man who ruled through fear, a man whose hands were stained with the history of the city's darkest corners. He was a monster who had made a throne out of shadows. And yet, these two innocent lives were looking at him as if he were a sanctuary. He walked toward them, his heavy footsteps slowing as he approached the sofa. Zara looked up, her amber eyes. His asterisk eyes, wide and searching. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" she whispered. Junhyuk reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he caught himself. His fingers were calloused, scarred from a lifetime of violence. He felt too large, too jagged, too dangerous for a room this quiet. He was a creature of war trying to learn the language of peace. Slowly, he let his hand settle on her head, his touch as light as a falling leaf. "She's a fighter," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Just like you. She'll be fine." "The man said you were our dad," Zion murmured, waking slightly and looking up at him with a sleepy, hopeful curiosity. "Are you? Or were you just pretending?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any threat Derek Lawson could ever devise. For a man who never stumbled over his words, Junhyuk found himself suddenly voiceless. He looked at his scarred knuckles, then back at the two faces that were the only pure things he had ever touched. "I stopped pretending the moment you sat at my table," he finally said, the truth of it cracking the ice around his heart. He wasn't just a boss anymore, he was a father. And as he looked at his daughters, he realized the reality of it was more terrifying than any war he had ever fought. To be a dad meant he had something to lose, and for the first time in his life, Kang Junhyuk was truly afraid. In a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Han River, miles away from the sanctuary of Junhyuk's estate, Derek Lawson paced the length of his office like a caged animal. The room was a monument to his ego, filled with high-priced art and digital monitors tracking the movements of a dozen different companies. But his eyes were fixed on a single, grainy photograph sent by his trembling lead cleaner. It was a shot taken from a hidden button camera, blurry and distorted, but the central figure was unmistakable. It showed a man in a black suit, sitting with a terrifying stillness, his hand clamped around a shattered wrist. Derek's fingers twitched as he zoomed in on the stranger's face. For 7 years, he had been haunted by the memory of the night Amara escaped him. He had convinced himself she had fled into the night alone, that her refusal to return to him was a symptom of a broken mind. But the existence of the twins had been a constant, stinging reminder that someone else had touched what he believed was his. He had spent a fortune and a decade trying to scrub that night from history, and now, the mystery was finally resolving into a solid, lethal reality. He turned to his chief of security, a man whose face was a mask of sweat and anxiety. "Who is he?" Derek hissed, his voice thin and sharp. "Who is the man who thinks he can take my property?" The security chief cleared his throat, his hands trembling as he laid a dossier on the mahogany desk. "His name is Kang Junhyuk, sir. But in the streets they call him the Dragon. He isn't just a businessman. He is the shadow that runs the Northern District. He spent the last few years moving his assets into legal sectors, but his reach is absolute. The men we sent to the cafe? They're already in the hospital. One of them will never use his hand again." Derek stared at the dossier, the blood draining from his face, as he read the list of Junhyuk's associations and the sheer scale of the violence he had overseen. The stranger Amara had slept with wasn't a random passerby or a lucky Samaritan. He was the most dangerous man in the country. A manic, high-pitched laugh escaped Derek's throat, echoing off the glass walls. The irony was a bitter pill. He had sent 3 low-level cleaners to retrieve his property from the one man who could turn his entire world into a graveyard. But obsession is a blind, hungry thing. Instead of fear, a toxic, possessive rage began to fill the vacuum in Derek's chest. He didn't see a powerful rival, he saw a thief. He saw the man who had stolen the purity of his vision for Amara. "He thinks he's a king?" Derek whispered, his eyes widening with a psychotic light. "He thinks because he has a gun and a name, he can keep them? They are mine. The woman, the children, everything." He turned back to the monitors, his mind already beginning to fracture under the weight of his entitlement. He knew he couldn't beat the dragon in a straight fight on the streets, but Derek Lawson was a man of modern warfare, of digital footprints, bot politicians, and deep web mercenaries who didn't care about Mafia honor. If Jun Hyuk wanted to play father, Derek would make sure he watched his new family burn. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact he had reserved for the darkest of circumstances. "Call the Vanguard group," he commanded. "I don't want a retrieval anymore. I want a scorched earth policy. If I can't have them, I want to make sure there's nothing left for the dragon to protect." The silence of the estate was a fragile thing, shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the perimeter lights. Deep within the reinforced walls of the master wing, Jun Hyuk felt the shift in the air before the first alarm could even chime. He was standing by the window, watching the rain wash over the Seoul skyline, when the world outside turned into a strobe light of silent, blue flashes, the discharge of suppressed weapons. Derek Lawson hadn't sent thugs this time. He had sent the Vanguard group, a pack of international ghosts who moved with the synchronized lethality of a scalpel. "Amara, get under the bed. Now," Jun Hyuk commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that brooked no argument. Amara, still pale and clutching her bandaged side, didn't hesitate, sliding into the reinforced alcove beneath the frame. Jun Hyuk turned to the twins. Zara and Zion were huddled in the corner of the room, their eyes wide as they watched their dad pull a heavy, matte black rifle from a hidden panel in the wall. This wasn't the man from the cafe. The warmth they had glimpsed in the infirmary was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus that made him look like a statue carved from obsidian. The bedroom door groaned as a breaching charge hummed against the hinges. Jun Hyuk didn't wait. He swept the twins into his arms, moving with a speed that blurred in the low light, and tucked them into a walk-in safe room hidden behind a floor-to-ceiling mirror. "Stay silent, no matter what you hear," he whispered, his amber eyes locking onto theirs for a fleeting second. "Close your eyes and count to 100. When you open them, I'll be here." The mirror slid shut just as the bedroom door exploded inward. The twins didn't close their eyes. Through a narrow, one-way viewing slit in the safe room's reinforced door, Zara and Zion watched the man they were learning to love turn into something else entirely. 3 mercenaries in tactical gear stormed through the smoke, their laser sights dancing across the room. Jun Hyuk didn't take cover. He moved through the haze like a shadow given form. He was a whirlwind of calculated, brutal efficiency. He didn't just shoot, he dismantled. He caught the first man's rifle barrel, redirecting the fire into the floor, before driving a palm into the man's throat with a sickening thud. The room filled with the rhythmic, muffled thunder of suppressed gunfire. The twins watched, frozen, as Jun Hyuk used the environment as a weapon. A heavy glass decanter shattered against a helmet. A tactical knife found its mark in a gap in body armor, and the once elegant bedroom became a theater of absolute carnage. There was no mercy in his movements, only a terrifying, mechanical precision. He moved like a dragon protecting its horde, his face a mask of primal, focused rage. He was the monster Derek Lawson had dared to wake, and he was proving that a father's love, when forged in the fires of the underworld, was the deadliest weapon on earth. When the last mercenary fell, slumped against the shattered remains of a designer dresser, the room returned to a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the hiss of the rain and Jun Hyuk's steady, rhythmic breathing. He stood in the center of the ruin, his shirt torn, a crimson smear across his cheekbone that wasn't his own. He looked toward the mirror. Slowly, he lowered the rifle, the predatory tension in his shoulders beginning to melt away as he remembered who was watching. He wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand and pressed the release code. As the mirror slid open, he saw the twins staring at him. Not with the terror he expected, but with a profound, solemn understanding. They had seen the dark side of their father, and for the first time they felt truly, irrevocably safe. The smoke from the breach hung in the air like a dying ghost, illuminated by the flickering emergency lights of the estate. The frantic adrenaline of the hunt had begun to settle into a cold, heavy ache in Jun Hyuk's bones. He didn't look at the bodies being dragged away by his silent, suit-clad cleanup crew. His focus was entirely on the doorway of the safe room. As the twins stepped out, their small feet navigating the debris of spent shells and shattered glass, Zion reached out and tentatively took his hand. Her fingers were tiny and warm against his blood-stained knuckles, a stark contrast that made him feel like a jagged blade trying to hold a silk thread. After ensuring the girls were settled in a secondary, untouched wing of the mansion under the watch of his most trusted lieutenants, Junhyuk returned to the infirmary. Amara was sitting on the edge of the medical bed, her face a mask of exhaustion and lingering terror. She had heard the muffled chaos of the assault from her hiding place, the sounds of a life she had spent 7 years running from finally catching up to her. When she saw him, disheveled, bleeding, and radiating a lethal aura, she didn't shrink away. Instead, she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the night at the Hyatt. Junhyuk approached her with the heavy, measured tread of a tired giant. He sat on a low stool beside her, his large frame hunched over, making him look smaller and more human than he had all night. He took a piece of sterile gauze and gently wiped a smudge of soot from her forehead. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of 8 lost years and the shared trauma of the last few hours. "I thought I could disappear," Amara whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at the bandages covering her side. "I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I raised them in the shadows, Derek would forget. But he doesn't forget. He thinks of us as things he misplaced, like a watch or a car." Junhyuk's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "He made a mistake," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "He thought he was the only one who could claim you. He didn't realize that the world belongs to those who are willing to bleed for it. I was a ghost for 7 years because I had nothing to live for. But now—" He looked toward the door where the twins had been, his amber eyes softening for the briefest of seconds before turning into flint. "Now I have everything." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, a rare sign of weakness, as he cupped her cheek. Amara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as she found an impossible sense of peace in the palm of a killer. "Amara, listen to me," he said, his tone shifting into a solemn, sacred promise. "I have spent my life taking things. I have built an empire on the broken remains of men who crossed me. But I am done being a ghost. I swear to you, on the blood that binds me to those children and the night I never forgot, Derek Lawson will never touch you again. I will tear down every wall he hides behind. I will burn his legacy until there isn't enough ash left to remember his name. You and the girls are under the wings of the dragon now, and nothing in this world or the next is ever going to hurt you again." Amara looked into his eyes and saw the truth of it. It was a terrifying promise, a blood oath that guaranteed a war, but for the first time in nearly a decade, the paralyzing weight of Derek's shadow felt lighter. She reached up, covering his hand with hers, and for a few minutes, the most dangerous man in Seoul simply sat in the quiet, holding on to the only family he had ever known. The giant was vulnerable not because he was weak, but because he finally had something worth losing. The transition from prey to predator was a silent, surgical shift. Junhyuk didn't retreat further into his fortress. Instead, he began to leave a trail of breadcrumbs so obvious that Derek Lawson's obsession would make them impossible to ignore. He leaked the location of a vulnerable safe house on the outskirts of the city, a secluded glass and steel villa nestled in the fog-drenched hills of Incheon. It was the kind of place a man would go to hide a family he loved, and to a mind as twisted as Derek's, it looked like a desperate surrender. Derek arrived at midnight, flanked by the remainder of his vanguard mercenaries. He rode in a bulletproof SUV, his heart racing with a toxic mixture of triumph and possessive rage. He could already see the silhouette of the villa against the moonlit mist. In his mind, he had already won. He imagined Junhyuk on his knees, begging for mercy while Amara and the twins were loaded into his private jet. He stepped out of the vehicle, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, and signaled for his men to breach. The front doors were unlocked. The house was silent, illuminated only by the cold, blue light of the moon reflecting off the marble floors. Derek walked into the center of the vast living room, his eyes scanning for his property. But as his men moved into the kitchen and bedrooms, their voices crackled over the radio in a chorus of confusion. "Sir, the house is empty. There's no one here." The heavy steel shutters of the villa slammed shut with the force of a falling guillotine, sealing every exit in a synchronized roar of mechanical power. Derek spun around, his breath hitching in his throat. The lights flickered to life, not in the warm yellow of a home, but in a blinding, clinical white. A single monitor on the wall hissed to life, revealing Jun Hyuk sitting in his armored study miles away, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. You always did like to watch people through a screen, Derek. Jun Hyuk's voice echoed through the villa's hidden speakers, smooth and lethal. You liked the power of being the one who sees while remaining unseen. So, I thought I'd give you a front row seat to your own ending. Suddenly, the monitors in the room began to scroll through Derek's life. Not his photos, but his crimes. Every offshore account, every drugged victim, every bribe paid to the Vanguard Group was being uploaded to the servers of every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the world in real time. Jun Hyuk hadn't just lured him to a physical trap. He had lured him into a digital execution. Derek's empire was evaporating with every second that passed. You didn't just come for a woman and children, Jun Hyuk continued, his amber eyes piercing through the screen. You came for the only things that made me realize I'm still alive. You used a drug to take her 7 years ago. Tonight, I'm using the truth to take everything you are. As Derek's mercenaries realized the authorities were already closing in on the villa's coordinates, they turned on their employer, realizing their paychecks had turned into prison sentences. Derek stood alone in the center of the room, stripped of his wealth, his men, and his dignity. He looked into the camera, screaming a wordless plea, but Jun Hyuk simply reached out and closed the laptop. The final hit wasn't a bullet. It was the total, systematic erasure of a man who thought he was a god. The dragon didn't need to be in the room to finish the hunt. He had already won, and as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Jun Hyuk turned away from the screen to the sound of his daughter's laughter in the hallway, finally leaving the world of shadows behind. 6 months after the echoes of the final confrontation had faded into the annals of the city's criminal history, the air in the Seoul family court was still and cool, smelling of old paper and fresh floor wax. Kong Jun Hyuk sat on a polished wooden bench, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He was no longer wearing the tactical gear of a predator or the bruised knuckles of a street fighter. He wore a navy suit tailored for a man who had finally found peace, though the amber intensity in his eyes remained, a quiet reminder of the dragon that lived beneath the skin. Beside him sat Amara. She looked radiant, the color having returned to her cheeks and the light to her eyes. The physical scars from Derek Lawson's obsession had healed into thin, silvery lines, but the emotional weight she had carried for 7 years was gone, replaced by a grounded, quiet strength. Between them sat Zara and Zion, dressed in matching floral dresses, their braids perfect, their expressions a mixture of solemnity and suppressed excitement. They weren't whispering in fear today. They were swinging their legs, waiting for the one door that would change their lives forever. The court official opened the heavy oak doors and beckoned them inside. The judge, a woman with graying hair and eyes that had seen 1,000 broken homes, looked over her spectacles as the group approached the bench. She looked at the thick folder in front of her. A dossier no longer filled with criminal records or surveillance reports, but with character references, psychological evaluations, and the meticulous trail of a man who had systematically dismantled his underworld empire to build a sanctuary. Mr. Kong, the judge began, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I have reviewed your petition for the formal adoption and name change. I see that you have stepped down from all previous corporate and private affiliations. You have established a trust for these children that ensures their future for generations. But more importantly, I see the testimony from Ms. Cole. She looked at Amara, who nodded firmly, her hand finding Jun Hyuk's under the table. The judge turned her attention to the twins. Zara, Zion, you understand what happens today. You are no longer just staying with Mr. Kong. You will legally be his. You will carry his name. You will be his daughters in every way the law can recognize. Zara looked up at Jun Hyuk, then at the judge. We stopped pretending a long time ago, she said, her voice clear and steady. He was our dad before we even knew he was. The judge smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the room's formal edges. She lifted her gavel. By the power vested in me, I grant this petition. From this moment forward, Zara and Zion Cole shall be known as Zara and Zion Kong. This family is no longer a matter of circumstance, but of law and choice. Click. The sound of the gavel hitting the sound block was the final note in a symphony that had begun with a shattered coffee cup in a quiet cafe. As they walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun, the twins didn't run ahead. They stayed close, one on each side of Junhyuk, clutching his hands. He looked down at them, feeling the warmth of their grip, and then at Amara, who was smiling at the horizon. For 8 years, Junhyuk had lived as a ghost, a man who existed but did not live. He had ruled a kingdom of shadows, but as he led his family toward the car, he realized he finally had a kingdom worth keeping. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't running. And as Zion looked up and called him Appa, without a hint of hesitation or fear, the dragon finally let out a long, slow breath. The hunt was over. The family was real. And the man who once had everything realized he had finally, for the first time, found home. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the lair of the dragon. If you're as moved by Junhyuk's transformation as I am, don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're celebrating this new beginning from. Would you like me to help you brainstorm a new story idea or perhaps a special episode focusing on the family's first year together?